Okay, tonight's presentation will be The Mystery of the Siberian Explosion, an environmental history of the Tunguska event by Andy Bruno from Northern Illinois University. In 1908, the Tunguska explosion in Siberia knocked down an area of forest larger than London. Most scientists believe that a fragment of an asteroid or a comet caused the blast, but neither a crater nor unmistakable remnants of a meteorite have ever been found. Over the last century, the mysterious nature of the event has prompted a wide array of speculation and investigation, including from science fiction writers and voluntary researchers. Some have even explained Tunguska as a nuclear explosion triggered by aliens. This presentation will recount the intriguing history of the Tunguska event and the investigations into it, foregrounding the significance of mystery in environmental history. It will show how efforts to understand the explosion have shaped the treatment of the landscape, how uncertainty allowed alternative forms of knowledge to enter scientific conversations, and how cosmic disasters have influenced the past and might affect the future. Andy Bruno is an associate professor of history and environmental studies at Northern Illinois University. A specialist in the environmental history of the Soviet Union, he is the author of 2 books, The Nature of Soviet Power, An Arctic Environmental History, and Tunguska, A Siberian Mystery and Its Environmental Legacy. Please welcome Andy Bruno.
Oh yeah, I should check that out. Yeah. I think he had the 4th coming, but it's been out now for a little bit. Thank you all for having me here. I'm very happy to be able to present for you all. Just the first note is that just so you where I am coming from is that I'm a professional historian. I work on what we call environmental history, which tries to look at how not just like environmental topics, but how people have interacted with the natural world in the past. And geographically, I've focused on Russia, including sort of far parts of Russia, Siberia, the far north. And of course, you know, I'm still in this moment now, post-2022, where figuring out what actually is possible in terms of research, because I spent a lot of time in Russia. I was last there in October 21, and obviously that's not going to be happening anytime soon, given the invasion of Ukraine and ongoing war there. So I want to talk to you today about this book that I wrote and published last year. First off, just a little bit about what this thing is, for anyone who hasn't heard about what Tunguska is. In 1908, it was this large explosion over part of central Siberia that is now seen most likely as the largest explosion of a meteorite in modern history, though for a variety of reasons I'm going to talk about, was not necessarily understood well when it happened or in the immediate decades of research after it happened. And it created an entire way of interacting with the natural world in the Russian case, in the Russian environment, that I think is a sort of distinctive, unique, interesting story that is very related to this. Now I want to start off the book. So I mean, the way I'm actually going to do this talk is to kind of go through the book. I wrote the book as a narrative book, and so I'm going to tell the story. But to put yourselves in the early 20th century, in 1908, and you are in the middle of a completely desolate region, and you come across images like this, where there's a bunch of trees knocked down, and they're all facing the same direction. A bunch of them are uprooted, but have the branches knocked off. And it goes on for miles and miles and miles. There's no roads nearby, there's no industrial works, there's nothing. Right? Okay, so what happened here? Maybe a forest fire? It doesn't really look like a forest fire because not all the trees are charred. Some are, but it has charred, not all of them. Maybe a meteorite, right? But in the early 20th century, if you were expecting there to be a meteorite, you'd think there'd be a crater, and you'd think there'd be a big chunk of metal, especially if there's a territory this large, right? And those things didn't happen. And that is part of the big story that gets us at why this event reveals such interesting things about human engagement with mysteries in the world, in the natural world. And so let me just give you a little bit of my sort of more historian analytical part here, and then I'll get to the good stuff. And what I argue in this book, we all as historians are supposed to have an argument for your books, is about this role that Tunguska shows us, about mystery having this function with human engagement with the natural world. And we see that both culturally and from the fact that people don't always know everything about nature, right? It's still the same today. Science keeps evolving, keeps changing, keeps developing, but there's always things that remain outside of its purview and remain mysterious or remain unexplained, and that's actually really important for understanding people's engagement with various environments, but especially this one. And I think that there's these three sort of main key things that we see about mystery sort of playing this fundamental role. First off is that the actual interaction with the landscape, this region, was this like very large region, larger than Manhattan, was determined by these efforts to try to figure out the mystery of Tunguska. So for most of the 20th century and even until today, the prerogatives, the imperatives to understand what happened here in 1908 has affected how people have treated that world. That's different than agriculture, that's different than urban development, that's different than a nuclear testing site, that's different than many different ways that the environment has been engaged with. And I think that's a really important part of the story. Another is that mystery allowed these unofficial actors to come in and play. And I'm going to talk a lot about them. It goes from everyone from science fiction writers to amateur researchers who go out there every summer trying to figure out what might have caused this. And they come up with all sorts of ideas. You heard about some of them already, but they range from comet or asteroid to Nikola Tesla's death ray dawn Orion. And then finally, Tunguska is this very interesting example where we're able to see people engaging with cosmic disasters, not just terrestrial ones, not just things like earthquakes and hurricanes and volcanic eruptions, but the idea that actually something in the cosmos could cause what we call a natural disaster. And there's a whole interesting history of thinking about it. And then finally, one thing about the sort of distinctiveness of my approach here is that I center my history of Tunguska on the Soviet story, right? I mean, I bothered to learn Russian. I've spent tons of time in Russia. I went to Russian archives. I interviewed Russian researchers. And while I do talk about the international part of it, and I will later this evening, I really think that actually the place-based approach of trying to get there and experience it that way was important to write as an account of it, not just sort of synthesizing everyone else's research. Okay, so now let's go to June 30th our time, June 17th, by the Russian calendar. They were still on an earlier calendar. And this massive explosion occurs in central Siberia. There's a map of Russia on the top there. The black little thing, you probably can't read it, but that's where the Tunguska site is. And then there's an inner map that shows about the size of it, 200 some square kilometers, 2,000 some square kilometers. And just to note, that's remote for Siberia, right? You might think Siberia is remote. Well, it's the size of the continental United States, and this part of Siberia is particularly far afield from any of the railroads or little towns that develop in Siberia. So it's very far from everything. And you have some witnesses, you have actually quite a number of witnesses, including the Evenki, who are an indigenous Siberian group who occupied much of this area of Eurasia, actually going from up into Mongolia as well as much of Siberia. And one of the sort of remarkable things is that we actually have these accounts of what the event was like that were collected in the 1920s by Soviet ethnographers. So this one woman, Akulina, who was about here, when the blast occurred, the epicenter is right here, and all of this area is where the trees fell down. She described waking up to this loud blast, these booms, things falling apart, and then coming with her husband Ivan and an elder Vasily, and then from an upland area seeing the place where there had been a forest and had all been knocked over. And so one point that I think is important about when you look at the first-hand observer accounts of what happened on that morning in 1908 is that you actually see the ways that it is a disaster. One myth about Tunguska is that no one died. Actually, the most recent reading of the evidence makes it very likely, or seem very probable that Akulima's husband Ivan died. His arm broke, he got sepsis, and the accounts are very sort of muted about it. They don't say he died, but they talk about it in ways that actually, if you understood and how Evenki talked about death, it makes it very clear what happened is that he died in the typhoon. There were also people who got injured, both nearby and pretty far away from the epicenter. Things that broke down, possibly 2 other people died. There were all sorts of rumors that spread around central Siberia after this attack because it was seen by people very far away. You end up getting something, more than 100 observers who later said, "Oh yeah, I saw something that morning. I saw a fireball in the air that came and it was loud, and then there were some loud explosions." But one of the rumors was that Japan had invaded. Russia had just fought a war with Japan in 1904, 1905 and lost. So this wasn't completely, coming from nowhere to think that the Japanese had invaded. There was also the Evenki idea that this was a spirit Agdi who was intervening in a dispute amongst different clan members by sending an iron bird down that caused this havoc. In some churches, there was an idea, priests said that this was God's punishment for the 1905 revolution that forced Tsar Nicholas II to create a parliament, the Duma, which he had promised never to do. I realize I should stop walking away. Sorry. There's also, of course, other layers in which there were profound effects. The forest itself was leveled. A bunch of reindeer apparently got smashed and died. Some birds that had been in the region stopped being there. And then you also later have evidence of anomalies in ants and pine needles where they grow. And just to be clear, at the time, it did make the news. It made the news in Siberian papers, and then it produced these these optical anomalies and abnormally white nights that spread throughout much of northern Eurasia, including into England. And those made scientific bulletins and astronomical journals at the time. But that was largely forgotten about. Something happened in Russia between 1908 and 1921, a big revolution that toppled the Tsarist regime and brought to power the Bolsheviks who created the Soviet Union. And in the midst of it, this guy, Leonid Kulik, who had been a supporter of revolutionary activities, but then sort of retrained himself as a mineralogist, started to become interested, became a mineralogist, then became the head of the meteorite department at the Mineralogical Museum, became interested in the Tunguska event. And this whole story of how Tunguska becomes a mystery and how we know it today and how we think about it is really inseparable from him and his perseverance. Because not anyone would have done what he did in terms of going out and continuing sustained field research in extremely difficult conditions. Because this was not something that, he even in his diary at one point said, "I don't know how to get there. The Evenki know how to get here. I can't do it." But then he kept trying and trying until he did. So he begins an expedition in well, he first learns about it in 1921, and then he conducts an expedition in 27 that gets and sees the site for the first time. He depends on eventkees to help him get there and to know where it is, but they actually don't want to go there because they have this feeling that this place is cursed. And they also are pretty suspicious of Russian or Soviet at this point, outsiders coming in to their homelands and territories. But once he gets back from his expedition in 27, he is able to get money to go on a larger expedition in 1928. And at this point, he brings a film crew, he brings a couple of extra researchers, and there's all sorts of, what happens is in the field, a bunch of the people who come with him get scurvy and other illnesses and have to evacuate. But he stays by himself. He has this whole, what might be planned, it's unclear, some have suggested this was planned. Well, one of the people who goes back is this journalist, Victor Seaton, who broadcasts, hey, this guy Kulik is out alone in the taiga. He's going to die if we don't send a rescue mission. All of a sudden, funds come pouring in that had not been previously available for this expedition. And he's able to continue this expedition when the newspapers start talking about, we need to save this hero scientist in the middle of the taiga because he's going to die out there alone. And for the first time, they start talking about Tunguska as a mystery. Before that, it had just kind of been a forgotten event. And it becomes a mystery through the sort of press and sensationalism of the second expedition. And even at this point, people like Kulik are writing poems, wondering when are we going to find our meteorite? Right? And there's after he gets back, there's at least two. I think there's a film that comes out that people fight to get in to see in Moscow or maybe in St. Petersburg. There's a board game that is released about be Kulik, go find, and you have to try to find the meteorite. It becomes a sort of popular sensation. But that's not the end of it, right? Kulik gets back, he's kind of in bad health, but he immediately secures money for a larger expedition to go back in 29. And this point is where all sorts of efforts to figure out the mystery of the missing meteorite come into play. So he uses things like geodesic surveying, magnetic surveying as well, obviously trying to look for an iron, a chunk of an iron meteorite on the ground, drilling, draining wetlands. This is in the middle of a sort of boggy area, like much of Siberia is, forest, sort of taiga forest mixed with boreal forest mixed with wetlands. Collecting samples, gathering eyewitness testimonies, and trying to do an aerial survey. The work on the bog is particularly arduous. There's this place they call the Susla funnel. They have to dig through it to try to drain it out because he's convinced that this must be where the meteorite is. We've got to drain this funnel, this water, and then we're going to find the meteorite there. They drain it. The workers who help build the ditch to do it are not very happy about it. I'll talk about that in a second. They drain it, and at the bottom they find a tree stump, which makes it pretty clear that a meteorite had not exploded in that exact spot. This whole endeavor becomes plagued with drama. There's denunciations against Kulik by some of the workers. This guy right here, who's literally holding to be in the picture. He's a Communist Party member, and he writes to the local Communist Party saying, Kulik's doing all of this bad stuff, and we gotta, he should be fired. Meanwhile, he's getting drunk in a nearby town, and part of all of this type of stuff. And that leads to many problems in the expedition itself. And ultimately, the expedition ends up failing. Right? They don't find a meteorite, and they're out there from 29 into 30, and they don't find a meteorite. Kulik isn't done. He keeps persisting in trying to go back. They do eventually get an aerial survey that was not able to, weren't able to complete that in 2930. In 37, or no, they tried in 37, but they get it in 38. And then they're planning a big expedition for 1941. But at that point, the Nazis invade, and that doesn't happen. And Kulik enlists immediately. He's 56 years old, but then he gets captured and dies in the Puerto camp pretty quickly. And that sort of, because of that, he's memorialized. They have a stamp from him that they put out in 1952. Okay, so that's the sort of first stage of the Tunguska story, is that these sort of, well, I guess the second stage. The first stage is the disaster itself. The second stage is these expeditions of Lindley and Kulik in the 20s and 30s. After the Second World War, a new phase begins, where that's inseparable from some larger contexts, I think, that are important to just understand. First off is the explosion of the bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan in World War II, which begins the nuclear age, and it becomes inspiring of certain fears and scenarios in science fiction worldwide. The space age later becomes a factor in this, but not immediately. The Cold War, the competition that replaces the allyship of the Soviet Union and the U.S. during World War II into a major geopolitical competition. The initial interest in UFOs that begin with Kenneth Arnold over Mount Rainier in Washington, and then there's the Roswell thing that has a blip right then, but it comes back a little bit later. And I think one thing that's also really important in the Soviet context is this is the post-war generation, the first generation that's actually educated, and it's somewhat paradoxical, but this interest in sort of UFOs and paranormal activity is actually more benefited by people who kind of know enough, having this large population of people who know enough about science that they get interested and think that they're going to kind of become their own amateurs, coming up with their own explanations for it. But I also argue that the Siberian landscape and where this occurred becomes this sort of laboratory for these unconventional explanations to come out, including, of course, that it was a Martian installation. The key figure here is a science fiction writer named Alexander Kazantsev, who he was stationed in Romania during the end of World War II. So he hears about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He had been in Tomsk during the Kulik expeditions and had been following them in the 20s and 30s. And he all of a sudden has this moment of like insight where he hears about the explosions over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he's like, well, maybe a nuclear explosion caused Tunguska. And then he's like, well, how could that happen? Is it possible to have a uranium meteorite? No. He goes through a different bunch of explanations with consulting with some of the people who had actually done some field work on the Tunguska site, and decides, well, maybe it was an alien spaceship. And he initially expresses this idea in a fictional story called Explosion that was published in this journal around the world in January 1946. And now, this was completely, the topic was, the story had two scientists, they go out and they have different explanations for what happened in Tunguska, and then this one turns out to be correct, and it's completely done as fiction. That did not stop the New York Times on April 1st, 1946 from saying, hey, the Soviets are saying there was a nuclear explosion in 1908, right? The New York Times is misreading this as not a work of fiction. Turns out, though, that they were kind of onto something because Kazantsev himself soon stages a show at the Moscow Planetarium that was designed to sort of give full air to this idea of that there should be a nuclear hypothesis that was involved in that explains Tunguska, And then soon after, in 51, he's already saying this in 48, but by 51 he's actually putting out pieces that that are sort of have like a nonfiction explanation to his whole story and saying, yeah, no, this is an active working hypothesis of what caused this. We should go out and investigate it, right? And this initiates a whole wave of ufology, becomes the sort of focal point for ufology in the Soviet Union, as well as other science fiction theorizing. So this guy right here, Felix Zeigel, becomes sort of one of the main UFO researchers in the 1960s and 50s and 60s in the Soviet Union. And he was actually this guy right here, who was involved in this initial planetarium show. Though he has his own sort of ideas about Tunguska. It also, of course, inspires lots of science fiction, including these three works right here that I list: Tunguska Brothers, Monday Begins on Saturday, Thomas Pynchon's Against the Day, and Vladimir Sorokin's Ice Trilogy, all feature Tunguska as a main sort of focus point. Stanislav Lem, who from an earlier generation had one of his earliest science fiction novels about Tunguska. So it becomes a fodder for all sorts of fiction, as well as other theories, including one that's developed by an American in the 1980s that it was Nikola Tesla experimenting with his death ray on Long Island that accidentally triggered Tunguska. And so this sort of creates a whole dynamic going on with the Tunguska story, where you have this sort of research on meteoritics occurring alongside the sort of more fantastic theories, and then they come together. While there's all of these polemics going on, because actually I should have said that the meteoritic establishment responds very angrily to Kazantsev. At first they help him sort of get these ideas out. They think it's going to be good PR to have a show at the Moscow Planetarium, and then they find out that people actually believe this is real, and they kind of go on that path. But in the late 50s, this is during the thaw era in the Soviet Union, where there was a bit of an opening in terms of cultural expression and certain types of freedoms. You get the emergence of these various groups including the Complex Amateur Expedition, who decide to go out and see what happened in Tunguska themselves. There are some groups, including this one guy, Zolotov, who are convinced that it must have been nuclear. He's a nuclear physicist, and he reads Kazantsev's story and becomes convinced it must be nuclear. But then there's these others who are just like, okay, we're going to just go out there and see what happened. And they begin these expeditions, and very quickly they end up collaborating with the Soviet Academy of Sciences, which represents the sort of official meteorite studies establishment of the Soviet Union. And they're, going out there, they are measuring radioactivity. They're doing all sorts of things. And one of the nice things about this research that I got to do is that I met two of the people from the very first of these amateur expeditions, and there's several more from many more from the later ones. This does change the amateur expeditions, or voluntary expeditions, changes the character of the research. So they're often open-ended, but they start looking for evidence of the nuclear hypothesis. Now, one thing that is very clear and is really important is that when the nuclear hypothesis comes out, it was the first time that Kazantsev was the first person to say, maybe this seems like it had to be above ground, right? That's now actually widely accepted that it must have been above ground. But the meteorite establishment was saying, at first was saying, no, it couldn't have been above ground. Meteorites don't explode above ground. It turns out Kazantsev was right, that it was above ground. But the people who were investigating it do all sorts of things. They measure radioactivity. They actually find increased radioactivity at the site initially. but that turned out to be both the radioactive profile of the Siberian traps that were on, plus it was 1959 through 1960 was the height of radioactive fallout. So both of those things influenced false reads, or not false reads, but reads that did not actually indicate that there was radioactivity from the site. They looked at peat and soil samples. They studied microsphericals. They started engaging in computer modeling. They looked at tree rings and burns on trees to try to gauge everything from the growth rate of the forest after the explosion. They studied genetic anomalies and things like ants and pine trees, looking at looked at things like thermoluminescence and geomagnetic anomalies. And all of these things were, they weren't necessarily designed to prove the nuclear hypothesis, but they were influenced by sort of adjudicating between these different ideas. At the same time, you have the rise of the comet explanation, which becomes what the Soviet meteoritic establishment gravitates towards and endorses. And that is that their thought was that, both because of the evidence of the trajectory that they had from eyewitness testimony, and because of the presumed density of the object, they figured that if it exploded, if a blast that size occurred in the above the air, it must have been a comet. Okay. Another part of this whole story, though, is not just what the research was for these voluntary expeditions. These voluntary expeditions created a whole very distinctive subculture amongst the Siberian students who went on. So, they do these ones in the first period of 59 through 61, but then they go back almost every year into the 1990s, where you get, a couple dozen to more than 100 people coming out to the middle of the Siberian wilderness to spend their sort of summer vacation doing research on what caused Tunguska. It is really sort of this interesting subculture that emerges. They develop their own songs, they develop their own poetry, they have their rituals about how they engage with the natural world, kind of develop their own, not necessarily environmentalism, but own sort of wilderness aesthetic. And their own relationships with wildlife. So they have all sorts of stories about chipmunks and the dreaded mosquitoes and gnats and horseflies, searching for bears in the taiga. They have a romance about the campfires that they have at the research stations, the romances that develop on these expeditions. And they talk about how they would have, these sort of freer atmosphere for expressing their thoughts that might be not oppositional to the Soviet regime exactly, but sort of outside the mainstream a little bit. They also, like many other sort of social phenomenon, had the same type of, or not same type, but had hierarchies of race, class, and gender that affected what went on there. In terms of race, the Evenki become very marginal in these expeditions. In the Kulik period, there were Evenki who participated, but by the 50s and 60s, the Evenki are very sort of marginal to the researchers who are coming there. They're relying much more on Russian and others. In terms of class, there's a very interesting way in which the Soviet Union was designed. One of the main goals was to overcome class oppression. But what happens in the Soviet society is that there's all sorts of these hierarchies that are related to privileges that people have, both educational and cultural, as well as monetary and based on wealth. And so this is pretty middle-class phenomenon, and they are kind of blind sometimes to the ways that they have these privileges vis-a-vis people who are assisting these expeditions in less acknowledged ways. And then gender is actually a very interesting thing. So when I first learned about this whole endeavor, I assumed that it was going to be mostly men going out and doing these expeditions. By the 1980s, it was equal. Actually, there were a lot of women who wanted to come out and be part of this endeavor of solving this Tunguska mystery, and they participated in these expeditions. They often, though, faced what is very common in the Soviet period, which was a double burden, where they were doing the work of the expedition, but then also cooking the food around the campfire and sort of taking on extra duties in the field as well. And then a final sort of just like not part about the social life of this group was the interesting ways that there was connections between the Communist Party, the KGB, and then dissidents within the Soviet period. So the leaders of these amateur expeditions, these voluntary expeditions, were Communist Party members. And it's pretty clear that a lot of this couldn't have happened if they didn't have that privileged status. In the Soviet Union, being a Communist Party member meant you were part of the elite, right? But that wasn't everyone, right? And you had access to all sorts of things. There were also dissidents who arose within it, and at moments there were very difficult tensions where some of the people were, the KGB was investigating these amateur expeditions, and people were denouncing each other to the secret police for having said something anti-Soviet or something like that, and friendships sort of fell apart. I can talk more about some specifics on that. Okay, and I'm getting closer to that now. I got two more chapters and a conclusion. Another part of this story is that there's this a story about nature conservation, because what happens is that during these expeditions, the researchers who are out in the taiga to figure out what happened in 1908, figure out the Tunguska mystery, help solve the mystery, come to care about preserving the crime scene, essentially. And that leads them to want to turn this into a nature reserve. The Soviet Union had a whole history of these actually very robust nature reserves called zapovedniki, which were kind of different than national parks in that, like, people weren't allowed to go there at all. They weren't tourist institutions. They were just sort of for scientific research. And by even the early 60s, they started a campaign saying, hey, maybe we should turn this into a nature reserve. And then as there increasingly is geological prospecting in sort of remote parts of Siberia, they become increasingly alarmed and fight for the creation of a nature reserve. There's a temporary reserve that gets created in the mid-1980s, and then a full one after the Soviet Union collapsed. And all sorts of people who have very different sort of perspectives on the Tunguska, the cause of Tunguska, are sort of unified in the idea that we have to preserve and protect this so that future generations can figure out what happened. Another part of this story is that what I feel is interesting about this is that you see very distinctive environmentalist ideas emerging. They're very different than the sort of Western U.S. story of environmentalism, where you have these organizations, these concerns about things like DDT, Earth Day, all of that. Very different. What you have instead is this sort of moment, especially during the Perestroika period in the late 80s and early 90s, where there's this deep pessimism that comes, that bubbles to the surface, where they think that civilizational collapse is imminent if actions aren't taken. And so it's a much more conservative type of environmentalism, even though it's expressed by avowedly Communist Party members. It's a very different, distinctive mix. Another thing about the protection regime after they established it in 1995 is that it does slowly make it more difficult for the voluntary researchers to access the site and continue their efforts. At first, they have this guy, Nikolai Vasilyev, who was one of the main leaders of the voluntary expeditions. He's the scientific head he's appointed the scientific head of the nature reserve, but he dies, after he dies in, I think, 2001, slowly but surely the nature reserve turns to more ecological research, and they allow Tunguska researchers to come in, but it becomes much more difficult than it was for them during the Soviet Union. All right, now finally, in the final chapter of the book, I step back and look at this whole event from afar and kind of give what I think is the most likely explanation. I take an agnostic approach because I'm not an astronomer, I'm not a specialist in all of this, and a lot of people have different views on this, but I tend to think that the mainstream view is mostly correct. And from the very beginning, you have international commentators thinking about what might have happened, and not since the very beginning, since the 1920s, really. You have international commentators thinking about what might have happened, proposing their own explanations. Some of them end up, converging with Soviet explanations, like the comet idea. Others end up being completely different, like not only the idea of Tesla, but the idea that it might have been caused by antimatter, which comes from American scientists Lincoln Lund Paz, or the idea that it might be a miniature black hole, which comes from another group of American scientists in the 1970s. All of that is happening, though, of course, while foreign researchers are not able to do their own on-site research. There are efforts there are proposals to send a British expedition in the 1930s, but the Soviets turned them down. So the first time that you actually get foreigners coming to the Tunguska site to do their own field research is only in the late 1980s and the 1990s. And at that point, you also get this group of Italians out of the University of Bologna who begin this sustained research. You have NASA start to become much more interested in near-Earth objects and the potential hazards that they pose, and do all sorts of computational models. They especially in the aftermath of the Shoemaker-Levy event in '94 and the Chelyabinsk event and meteorite in 2013. They invest a lot of effort in using the data that has been produced by this generation of Russian and Soviet researchers, and coming up with their own sort of models. And it's, of course, at the point now where the UN recognized International Asteroid Day is been put on June 30th to commemorate the Tunguska explosion. And all of that means that while there's still sort of ideas out there and different explanations for what might have caused it, including Martian meteorites and all sorts of things, the main idea is that it was an airburst explosion by a medium-sized stony, maybe carbonaceous, but most likely stony asteroid. Now, in the conclusion of the book, I kind of get personal about my own sort of efforts to do it and try to extrapolate some sort of ideas about what this whole story might mean for the world. This is as close as I got to the Tunguska site. I got all the way to this village of Vanavara, 60 kilometers away. I was supposed to go down and get to Vanavara. I was supposed to go down and see the site where these researchers have been going and going and going, but there were forest fires that year in Siberia that prevented that from happening, and I ended up to see it through a helicopter. A year later, worse forest fires happened in Vanavara, and this image circulated around the media. This is in Vanavara. I had stood right there the year before, and then when I came back and was writing this stuff, and it was June 2020, and we're all wearing masks because of COVID. This struck me as even more eerie given the environmental perils and disease perils that the world faces. But all that is to say, these connections made me actually think more about the ways that we've lived with a cosmic disaster already, and that should inspire us more to do things like invest in the planet we have, as opposed to entertain ideas of colonizing Mars and things like that. So I embrace planetary embeddedness rather than cosmic escapism. And I think that's actually a lesson from the Tunguska story that's different than we might expect from just hearing about outer space and aliens and all of that. Thanks. I'm happy to answer any questions.
So one I have is how is this different from the Shokolavinsk? Was this much greater? Were there enough similarities where we could say, yeah, it must have been?
Yeah, so they're actually quite similar.
Okay.
But Chelyabinsk was small. Chelyabinsk was, and of course, Chelyabinsk was known at the time, seen on dash cams. They send an expedition out and they collect material right away that it was definitely of meteoritic origin. Not for all of it, but definitely a meteoritic origin. And Chelyabinsk causes some injuries because of broken glass and shattered buildings and things like that. But it was not it did not pack nearly as much oomph to level a forest the size of Tunguska. So estimates vary, but Tunguska was seen as probably somewhere between 30 to 60 meters in diameter, whereas Chelyabinsk was much less than that. Yeah.
Any update on the Johnstone?
Yeah. So let me tell the Johnstone story. So there's one of the groups of voluntary researchers was led by this man named John Anfinigan. And he was literally named John. He's a Russian, but John. I think he was named after an American who had come over to help with some engineering project in the 1930s. And he released this group that finds this stone in, I think it was 67, that seems out of place in the midst of the site. And there's additional tests that go on. It ends up being sedimentary as opposed to igneous. But him and his family proposed that this might have still been a sedimentary meteorite of Martian origin if it had been ejected from deep enough on Mars. Most recent evidence I know still leaves this inconclusive, though most people doubt it, that it actually was that. I don't know of any post-2019 data that has shown that has sort of strengthened the case. Yeah.
You might have said at the beginning, but how long did it take for news that something happened to get around like the other side of the world?
How long did it what?
How long did it take for the news that something happened in Tunguska to get around to
weeks, days, not so. So there's immediately, like pretty soon after, within a week after, there's news that clippings within Siberia itself, and then published reports are already appearing in July in like London and stuff like that about people who had seen these bright anomalies. But they noticed it right after. It was days after that they noticed these optical anomalies and reported them and then wrote that, but it was published a little bit later. So pretty much right after. But then, essentially the international news was like, hey, there was some weird optical anomalies tonight. And then that was it. There was no connection with that and the explosion outside of Russia that I found. Yeah.
I just want to say I find this interesting because I was telling a couple of guys before the presentation, I remember being about 13 years old and reading about this. And it was mainly a guy from Cleveland who used to have a radio show and wrote all these books. And all he was pushing, it had to be an atomic explosion, and because we didn't have atomic energy yet, it obviously had to be an extraterrestrial ship that exploded.
There are a lot, yeah, there are a lot.
This is
of people who-
interesting.
And there's still some people, I mean, I should have, one thing, so when let me go back here for a second. So these two men here, this is the literally machine
Yeah,
code,
yeah, it was right there. When
and Nabi Plahana. There's Plahana, and there's Kashimikov right there. So this is them in 1959. When I met them, Plahana, who was sort of the initial person who was like, we got to go out there and see if it's actually a meteorite, or actually an alien ship, he thought it was definitely a meteorite. After Chelyabinsk, it became clear. He still thought Kazantsev was correct when I met him in 2018. Steele was like, nope, that's what it had to be. So, yeah.
So the burn on the trees, is it more like a sustained burn, or is it more like a flash burn?
That was what they were trying to determine, whether it could have been a flash burn that would have been caused by a nuclear explosion. My understanding of the best evidence is that it could have been just caused by a forest fire, that it was triggered from a meteorite explosion. But I don't want to speak to that too confidently because I only sort of I've read a lot of the details, but I haven't tried to parse which one of those I think is necessarily more accurate. Yeah.
Do you have an idea of how many scientific papers have actually been published?
Oh, thousands. Especially if you look in other languages. So there's a lot of excellent material out there in English, but one thing that the Russian material is even more robust. And that's the best stuff is of absolutely wonderful quality, but there's also a lot that's not necessarily. I mean, same thing with the English stuff. There's plenty of not very high quality stuff published in the English sphere, but it's kind of easier to be like, okay, well, was it limited to these types of journals, and then you see it, whereas a lot of the Russian academic publications, that you can find a very small, maybe suspect sounding journal, and it actually has really good research, and then another one, and it doesn't have good research. So it's a little bit harder to determine. Yeah?
Was a lot of the early evidence collected and preserved so that it could be analyzed using modern techniques?
So yes, a lot of it has been preserved. Some of it is not as accessible. So the stuff from the Kulak expeditions was collected by the Committee of Meteorites at the Soviet Academy of Sciences, stored in Moscow. And then one part of the story I didn't actually mention is that some of those samples that they had there, they looked back at them. Someone decided to retest them in the mid-50s. And like, hey, we found nickel and iron materials in here. Turns out they were stored poorly, and they had been contaminated with the Sihota-Alin meteorite fall of 48. And so, or 49, I'm forgetting off the top of my head. And so what exactly, if those samples are still there today, I'm not 100% sure. I believe they are, but I'm not sure how useful they are. When I went, I did go to the Committee of Meteorites and asked what archival materials and things like that I could possibly see, and they were the only ones that told me to kind of buzz off. It's already been processed and looked at, which was true. There was actually published accounts that had a bunch of the documents and all of this type of stuff. So they weren't totally wrong about that, but that was the one place I sort of ran into people who didn't necessarily want to open all their files for me. But I don't think that was, I'm not suspicious of that. I just think that they get a lot of requests and don't necessarily want to risk stuff getting contaminated. Yeah.
So when did you complete the research for the book?
I completed the sort of stuff in Russia in 2018, and then continued doing research just from other libraries and home, and then started writing in 2020. The writing process takes longer. There is one thing that was important for this research as well was there's an online database that was produced by some of the voluntary researchers who put up all sorts, just tons of files and tons of materials. You need to read Russian to use it, but it made the research actually a lot easier. Because I mean, I would often be like, okay, this thing from this publication, I'd read their version, I'd cross-check it with, some other, the actual original, and then I'd kind of feel confident about what was there. But they had done a lot of this curating of the material and putting it in one place already to make the research easier. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for writing this book, because when Yana told me about this book, it's a very good synthesis of science, culture, and history in it. I mean, it's a truly good book. I thank you for writing it.
Thank you. Thanks for reading it. And I love that. I love that we know So Yana, who is Yana, and she also goes by Nina. Anfinaginov is this person, John Anfinaginov, who I just mentioned, daughter, and she was one of the unsung heroes of my project. I wrote to her before coming to Tomsk. Someone told me to get in touch with her, and then she's the one who introduced me to all of the veteran researchers who were still alive, and really the oral histories of these people who had been part of these expeditions from the 50s onwards really added a huge amount to the project.
Thank you.